For 2 decades, Elijah Griggs mopped the marble floors of Ravelin Corp while being ridiculed by the same people who stole everything from him. But behind every mop stroke was a plan. A plan built in silence. A plan fueled by betrayal. What would you do if the man you treated like trash held the keys to your empire? Tonight, the janitor takes the throne. But when power changes hands, who really wins? Elijah Griggs shuffled through the double-glass doors of Ravelin Corporation every evening at 7 p.m. sharp, a faded utility belt slung over one hip and a mop handle balanced across his shoulder like a soldier's weapon. Most employees didn't know his name, let alone acknowledge him. He was the janitor, or that guy with the bucket, a faceless ghost who slipped through the polished floors, quietly wiping away smudges, spilled coffee, and secrets. The Ravelin building soared 72 floors into the city skyline, a fortress of steel, glass, and arrogance, and yet Elijah had memorized every inch of it like a blueprint etched into his mind. He worked silently under the flicker of fluorescent lights, disappearing into service elevators and duct-lined hallways, becoming part of the architecture itself. The executives, in tailored suits and $100 haircuts, never noticed the way Elijah lingered outside certain boardroom doors or how his eyes followed specific conversations on glass whiteboards. They certainly never questioned why, after 20 years, he never once asked for a raise, a promotion, or a single day off. To them, he was background noise. But Elijah listened. Every merger, every hostile acquisition, every time Daniel Royce, the CEO, strutted through the halls barking orders into his Bluetooth earpiece, Elijah took note. He knew the assistant's computer password before she did. He knew the CFO was hiding something in his offshore accounts. He knew who was sleeping with whom and which contracts were forged. He knew it all, not because he was nosy, but because he was patient. For 2 decades, Elijah observed a kingdom that had once been half his, before it was stolen from him. Each broom sweep, each elevator ride with eyes cast downward, was a silent vow to himself. The staff whispered jokes about him. A few interns even filmed TikToks mocking his stoop and calloused hands. None of them knew that the man they ridiculed in passing had more access to their fates than their department heads. None of them could imagine that the reason Elijah walked those halls wasn't because he needed a job, but because he needed revenge, and he needed it done right. His name wasn't even Elijah Griggs, not originally. But that, like so much else in the story of Ravelin Corp, was a truth buried beneath layers of lies. One Thursday evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline and the lights flickered on inside the executive suite, Elijah paused. Through the glass, he watched Daniel Royce celebrating another deal with champagne and laughter, unaware that just a few inches beyond the glass, the floor cleaner was timing his final move. The janitor nobody noticed had just finished cleaning the surface. Now it was time to reveal the dirt beneath. Before Elijah Griggs became the quiet shadow gliding through marble corridors, he was Elijah Thornton, the co-founder of Ravelin Corporation and the genius mind behind its original patented data encryption system. In the 1990s, Elijah had been the visionary, the one who sketched algorithms on napkins and stayed up coding through sunrise. Daniel Royce, his college roommate and best friend at the time, had been the people person, the polished talker, the salesman with charm. They were supposed to build the company together, one brain and one mouth, until one silent betrayal cracked that dream forever. Elijah had trusted Daniel with a prototype, letting him present it alone at a venture capital meeting when Elijah's father died unexpectedly. By the time he returned, the company had been incorporated, contracts signed, and Elijah's name was missing from every document. He confronted Daniel once, just once. Daniel smiled, leaned back in his leather chair, and said, "The board thinks a black face on the brand might scare investors. You're a genius, Elijah. But I'm the face." That moment broke something deep in Elijah's spirit. The betrayal wasn't just legal, it was personal, spiritual, and humiliating. His lawyers said it would be a losing battle, and the media would bury him. So Elijah disappeared. For years, no one knew where he went. He sold everything he had, cut off contact with family, and went underground. But he wasn't hiding. He was watching. He assumed a new identity, quietly reinvesting every cent he earned into micro-shares of Ravelin Corporation and its subsidiaries through anonymous shell companies. Over the years, he became a phantom investor, eventually controlling nearly 52% of the voting shares without anyone realizing it. Meanwhile, he trained his body to endure hard labor and took up janitorial work at Ravelin not out of desperation, but out of strategy. He didn't just want revenge from the outside, he wanted to dismantle the empire from within, floor by floor. Every broom he pushed was a reminder of where he came from and what had been stolen. He began memorizing the routines of every department, cataloging names, faces, behaviors. He kept a coded journal with initials and timestamps, noting patterns, alliances, moments of weakness. Some nights he would stand in the server room, fingers brushing the cool steel casing of machines built on his stolen ideas, feeling a mixture of pride and rage. One evening, a young software engineer named Trina complimented him out of nowhere, telling him he seemed too sharp to be cleaning floors. He smiled faintly but said nothing. It was one of the few moments of humanity he'd experienced in years. But for the most part, he kept to himself, waiting for the cracks in the empire to widen. And they did. Over time, he noticed Daniel had grown careless, arrogant. The company culture that once celebrated innovation had become bloated with nepotism and backdoor deals. Elijah saw the difference in how the new generation treated people, especially people they thought were beneath them. He knew the timing wasn't right yet, but it was getting closer. He began buying up old hardware, recovering fragments of code from Ravelin's early days, his code, archiving it meticulously. On paper, he was a nobody. But in the shadows of the server logs, in the encrypted voting shares scattered across holding firms, he was everything. His return to the heart of the company wasn't an accident. It was a slow-burning siege. And the board, the employees, even Daniel himself, were completely unaware that their janitor was in fact the ghost of the company's true founder, back not to reclaim his seat, but to decide who deserved one at all. It happened on a rainy Thursday, the kind of bleak, colorless day that turned Ravelin's massive windows into mirrors reflecting only the grayness outside. Elijah had just finished scrubbing a coffee spill near the executive lounge when he noticed something unusual. A young intern named Maddie kneeling beside him, helping gather paper towels that had slipped from his cart. She didn't ask for permission, didn't hesitate, and didn't flinch when the VP of marketing strode by with a look of amused disgust. Most people avoided Elijah like a stain, but Maddie looked him in the eye and smiled. She whispered, "I see you here every day. You're always so focused. My dad says people who stay quiet usually think the loudest." Elijah felt something strange in his chest, warmth, or maybe warning. He nodded, grateful but cautious. 2 hours later, during a department-wide meeting, Elijah was sweeping behind the glass when Maddie was called out by name and publicly fired. Not for underperformance, not for theft, but for inappropriate engagement with non-professional staff, a thinly veiled reprimand delivered by Daniel Royce himself. He made a joke of it, mocking janitorial fraternization as beneath company decorum. The room laughed. Maddie looked stunned. Elijah watched from the hallway, hand tightening around his mop. That moment split the air like a thunderclap. The cruelty wasn't new, but this time, it landed differently. This wasn't just the system cannibalizing itself, this was Daniel, once again, punishing decency to protect image. The young woman had shown a kindness that no one else had in 20 years, and it had cost her everything. Elijah returned to the basement that night, but he didn't go to the janitor's locker room. Instead, he opened the dusty maintenance cabinet and slid open a hidden panel he'd built years ago. Inside was a secure briefcase, weathered, metallic, and covered in biometric locks. He pressed his thumb against the scanner, and the panel clicked open. Inside was a treasure trove of old drives, legal records, audio recordings, and a laptop with no internet connection, his archive. He plugged it in, and the screen flickered to life, revealing a network of folders labeled by date and department. Elijah wasn't just watching Ravelin for vengeance anymore. He realized he had a responsibility to stop it before more innocent people like Maddie were broken by the same machine that once devoured him. Over the following nights, Elijah began a campaign of silent sabotage. He sent anonymous emails to the legal department using encrypted burners, hinting at potential whistleblower leaks. He left a printout of an internal memo showing racial bias patterns in hiring on the desk of the HR director. He scheduled false maintenance windows to observe sensitive meetings from behind mirrored glass. Each move was precise, invisible, and devastating. Soon, executives were whispering about breaches, and the compliance officer initiated an internal audit. The building buzzed with paranoia, but no one suspected the man with the mop. Elijah also found Maddie's contact through an old favor owed by a still loyal IT engineer and arranged a private meeting in a small diner across the city. There, he slid her a manila envelope. Inside were confidential reports proving Daniel's vendetta and her illegal termination. Maddie stared at him, wide-eyed. "Who are you?" she whispered. Elijah smiled faintly and said, "Just someone who got tired of waiting for justice to arrive on time." With her evidence, Maddie hired a labor attorney and filed a formal complaint with the Federal Labor Board. The company tried to settle quickly and quietly, but the story was out. Employees began to ask questions. Rumors swirled. Meanwhile, Elijah remained in the background, always cleaning, always watching. But he knew the balance had shifted. The board was meeting more often. Daniel looked increasingly strained. Elijah could feel it. The tower was tilting. He had ignited the fuse. All that remained was timing. The janitor with the quiet eyes had drawn first blood. And no one at Ravelin had any idea just how much further he was willing to go. The tremors Elijah had started were beginning to ripple through the bones of the company. Ravelin's top brass couldn't quite articulate what felt off, but a sense of quiet dread clung to the halls like mildew. Executives who once strutted now glanced over their shoulders. Department heads whispered more than they spoke aloud. The weekly numbers were beginning to show irregularities, discrepancies in data flows, strange routing of internal funds, missing sign-offs that had supposedly been approved. Elijah, meanwhile, remained invisible, clutching his mop like a sword in its scabbard as he slipped through floors like a phantom. He no longer needed to record data or hoard files. He had more than enough. Now, his role was psychological. He adjusted thermostats in executive rooms, left doors ajar that should have been locked, moved chairs just slightly off-center, erased calendar appointments from desktops he passed on night shifts. The building's upper ranks began to feel haunted, and they were, by their own deeds. It wasn't long before Daniel called an emergency leadership meeting, a closed-door session in the high-security boardroom on the 60th floor. Elijah was there an hour before, cleaning the hallway as planned, and when the last executive entered, he slid a micro-listening device under the side table. From a janitor's closet 3 doors down, he listened as Daniel ranted about infiltration and disloyalty, his voice cracking with panic. He accused middle managers of leaking documents, threatened the head of compliance with termination, and referred to lower employees as leeches and maggots who forgot they owe us everything. Elijah leaned against the mop handle, closing his eyes for a moment. The voice was different now, less polished, more venomous. Power had soured Daniel. But beneath the rage was fear, and that fear made him sloppy. Elijah waited until the building was empty before entering the executive suite with his master key. He used the emergency override on Daniel's personal server, uploading a backdoor program he'd written decades ago, the same foundational architecture Ravelin had built upon. It recognized his encryption signature like a long-lost child returning home. From there, he had access to everything. He uncovered embezzlement trails masked as development budgets, foreign kickback transactions hidden through shell contracts, and perhaps most damning of all, a recording of Daniel mocking a female employee's disability during a corporate retreat, something that, if leaked, would ignite a firestorm. But Elijah didn't just want exposure. He wanted precision. He compiled a dossier that traced Daniel's actions back to the board, showing that they had not only been aware, but complicit. Each member had signed off on fraudulent budgets and received performance-based bonuses inflated by manipulated numbers. Elijah knew the board wouldn't take the fall for Daniel unless cornered like animals. So he crafted the trap. An anonymous packet was delivered to each member's home with a simple note: "If I go down, you all go with me. Unless you act first." Fear is a master motivator, and within days, the chairman of the board discreetly removed Daniel's executive privileges under the guise of a temporary mental health sabbatical. But Daniel, paranoid and sharp as ever, suspected something deeper. He demanded a private audit of internal operations, and that's when Elijah made his boldest move yet. One evening, Elijah walked into Daniel's office while he was gone, wearing his cleaning uniform as always. He sat in Daniel's chair, opened the drawer, and pulled out an old photo. The two of them, younger, smiling, arms around each other at Ravelin's groundbreaking ceremony. Elijah stared at it for a long time. Then he flipped it over and scrawled 2 words on the back: "You forgot." He left it centered on the desk. When Daniel returned the next morning, he found it. According to security logs, he didn't speak for 7 full minutes. Just sat there, staring at it, as though the past had come alive and stood over his shoulder. From that point on, Daniel stopped sleeping. He barked at assistants, snapped at lawyers, and increasingly demanded tighter security. But none of it mattered. Because the greatest threat wasn't outside the building or among his rivals. It was inside, mopping his floors, walking his halls, and reclaiming what had been stolen, not through violence or public spectacle, but through a slow unraveling that no one could stop. Daniel was surrounded. And the worst part, he didn't even know who his enemy was. The day of reckoning arrived on the morning of Ravelin Corporation's annual shareholders' summit, a meticulously orchestrated pageant of power, wealth, and false smiles. The grand conference hall on the 72nd floor had been prepared to perfection. Crystal water glasses aligned like soldiers, mahogany chairs gleaming under recessed lighting, and a digital welcome screen cycling the names of board members and department heads. It was a spectacle meant to showcase dominance, not vulnerability. Elijah arrived as he always did, dressed in his dark grey janitorial uniform, pushing his cart down the corridor past employees too self-absorbed to notice the familiar shadow in their midst. But this time, he didn't head for the bathrooms. He stopped just outside the conference hall, where a sleek black garment bag hung on the coat rack by the service closet, a suit tailored for power, not for labor. Inside the closet, Elijah changed. When he stepped out moments later, the transformation was so complete, so jarring, that 2 passing executives gave him a double take before convincing themselves they'd mistaken him for someone else. At precisely 9 a.m., the board members took their seats at the massive circular table. Daniel Royce stood at the front of the room, rehearsing the same tired speech about innovation, dominance, and market expansion. He was pale, jittery, and clutching a stress ball in his left hand. His confidence was gone, replaced by the edge of desperation. As he launched into his address, the room's double doors creaked open, and silence fell. Elijah walked in, shoulders square, suit razor-sharp, eyes piercing. For a moment, no one spoke. A few chuckled, assuming he was lost or confused. Daniel squinted, unsure whether to laugh or panic. Elijah stepped forward and calmly placed a leather folder on the boardroom table. "Before we proceed," he said, voice smooth but commanding, "I believe there's been a change in majority ownership." A projector whirred to life behind him, displaying the Ravelin shareholder ledger on the massive screen. A red box highlighted a line item, ET Holdings, 52.3% voting rights. The room erupted. The chairman stammered, demanding clarification. The CFO blurted out denials. But Elijah remained poised, tapping through slides that traced decades of silent acquisitions, shell mergers, and stock accumulations. Each move legal. Each holding purchased through legitimate, traceable transactions. He had acquired control from the shadows, and now he stood in the light, unrecognizable to the very people who'd once stolen everything from him. Daniel stood frozen, mouth ajar, face drained of blood. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, more to himself than anyone else. Elijah stepped forward, eyes locked onto Daniel's. "I'm Elijah Thornton. You remember, don't you? The man you erased." A gasp escaped someone's lips. The chairman looked ready to faint. But Elijah wasn't done. He tapped once more, and a video began to play, audio footage of Daniel's derogatory comments about female employees, his admission of fraud, his mocking of disabled staff. The evidence was irrefutable. Elijah then opened the final file, a board resolution with blank signature lines and one bold header. Motion to remove Daniel Royce from CEO position effective immediately. One by one, with shaking hands, the board members signed. Not out of morality, but out of survival. Daniel screamed threats, but they were hollow. His badge was deactivated. His access revoked. Security was summoned. And as he was escorted out, Suit disheveled, hair damp with sweat, he looked back at Elijah, who now stood in the center of the room not as a janitor, not as a ghost, but as the architect returned to claim his creation. Elijah didn't celebrate. He simply turned to the board and said, "Effective today, there will be changes." Then he walked out, leaving the room stunned, silent, and shattered. The company had been turned upside down in under 20 minutes, and no one had seen it coming. Not the board, not the executives, not even Daniel, who once believed Elijah was nothing more than a forgotten man with a mop. But power, when wielded in silence, has a way of erupting with the force of a lifetime. And today, that silence had spoken. The headlines the next day were explosive: CEO ousted in shock coup, corporate power grab stuns Wall Street, mysterious majority shareholder reveals identity. But none of them mentioned Elijah Thornton by name. He declined every interview, ignored every media request, and disabled all public-facing records tied to ET Holdings. To the world, it was a story of boardroom chaos and internal politics. But to those who had watched Elijah push a mop down the halls of Ravelin for 20 years, it was something else entirely, an awakening. Maddie returned to the company that week, not as an intern but as the newly appointed head of ethics and employee relations. Elijah had sent her the offer himself, along with a handwritten note that simply read, "Don't let kindness become a casualty." She accepted immediately, becoming a quiet but fierce force for transformation inside the company. Several executives who had laughed the loudest during Daniel's reign quietly resigned in the weeks that followed, claiming health reasons or family priorities. But among the remaining staff, a strange hush settled in the air. They whispered in hallways, retraced old conversations, wondering aloud if they had ever insulted or belittled the janitor who turned out to be their boss. Some lived in guilt, others in awe, a few in fear. Elijah made no effort to punish them. That wasn't the point. He wasn't there for revenge anymore. It was about reclamation. Restoring what had been stolen not with vengeance, but with vision. And that vision was already underway. Within 30 days, Elijah slashed bloated executive bonuses, restructured profit sharing for lower-tier employees, and terminated all shell contracts used for tax evasion. He didn't raise his voice in meetings. He rarely spoke at all. But when he did, it was with the weight of someone who had waited 2 decades for the right moment to speak. The board, still reeling from the shift, followed his lead not out of admiration, but necessity. His silence was louder than any speech. One day, an employee who'd only ever known Elijah as the janitor approached him in the elevator. She looked embarrassed, fumbling for words. I never realized. Elijah gently raised a hand to stop her. It's not what people call you that defines you, he said. It's what you answer to. She nodded, blinking tears, and stepped off at her floor. Alone again in the elevator, Elijah exhaled. His reflection stared back at him in the polished chrome. The man looking back wore the same eyes, the same stillness, but something else now lingered there, closure. A week later, Elijah submitted a sealed letter to the board and vanished. No farewell speech. No press conference. Just a resignation and a transition plan appointing an interim leadership team committed to the company's new values. Security footage showed him exiting the building at 5:59 p.m., briefcase in hand, wearing the same grey janitor's uniform he'd worn on his first day. He had entered quietly, and now he left the same way. Rumors swirled for months. Some said he'd retired to a cabin in the mountains. Others claimed he was funding educational programs under different names. One theory even suggested he'd never existed at all, that he was a symbol created by a disillusioned staff desperate for justice. But the truth was simpler, and far more powerful. Elijah had gotten what he came for. Not just the company. Not just justice. But proof. Proof that dignity, patience, and silence could move mountains. That a man who cleaned your floors might one day decide your fate. And so, in the building he had once co-founded, where he had mopped up the footprints of men who thought themselves giants, Elijah had written his final chapter, not with revenge, but with restraint. He didn't need applause. He didn't need recognition. He only needed to know that the foundation had been reset. That something better might grow from the wreckage. And maybe, just maybe, The next person who reached out to help someone below them wouldn't be punished, but promoted. The janitor was gone. The empire remained. But now, it stood on new ground. And somewhere far from the skyline, Elijah walked freely, not as a ghost, not as a king, but simply as a man who had finally finished the job.